In the deep, silent birch forests outside Moscow, in the late summer of 1915, a secret was being kept. If you were a peasant walking through those woods, you might have heard a sound that didn't belong in nature. The sound of hammers ringing against steel, the roar of massive engines being tested, the shouting of engineers, and if you dared to get close enough to the clearing, you would have seen a silhouette that looked like a hallucination. Towering above the treetops was a machine so large it blocked out the sun. It stood nearly 30 feet tall. It was 60 feet wide. It bristled with cannon turrets and machine gun sponsons. But the most terrifying part was its shape. It didn't look like a tank. It looked like a tricycle built for a god of war. It rested on two colossal spoked wheels, each one 9 meters in diameter. Wheels so big that a man standing next to them wouldn't even reach the axle. This was the Netophon, the Tsar Tank, the largest armored vehicle ever constructed in the history of warfare. It was designed to end the First World War in a single afternoon. It was supposed to crush the German trenches, snap trees like twigs, and march unstoppable to Berlin. Instead, it became the biggest, heaviest, and most expensive lawn ornament in history. This is the story of the engineering madness that gripped the Russian Empire and the day the laws of physics defeated the will of the Tsar. To understand why this monster was built, we have to step back into the blood and mud of 1914. The First World War had ground to a halt. The illusion of a quick victory was gone. The armies of Europe were locked in a deadly stalemate, buried in trenches that stretched from Switzerland to the sea. Between the trenches lay no man's land, a hellscape of craters, barbed wire and mud. Any soldier who tried to cross it was cut down by machine gun fire. The generals on both sides were desperate. They needed a trench crosser. They needed a machine that was bulletproof, that could roll over barbed wire and crush enemy bunkers. In Britain, engineers were secretly developing land ships that used caterpillar tracks, metal belts that spread the weight over a large area. These would become the famous Mark I tanks. But in Russia, an engineer named Nikolai Lebedenko had a different theory. Lebedenko looked at the primitive tractors of the time and saw a problem. Small wheels got stuck in ruts. Tracks were heavy and broke easily. He believed the answer was simple geometry. If a wheel is big enough, he argued, it cannot get stuck. A wheel with a diameter of 9 meters could simply step over a trench the way a human steps over a crack in the sidewalk. He envisioned a machine of speed and violence, not a slow, crawling box like the British tanks, but a high-speed fortress that would terrify the enemy just by its appearance. He built a working model. It was made of wood, powered by a gramophone spring. In a private audience at the Winter Palace, Lebedenko presented this toy to Tsar Nicholas II. The scene was surreal. The ruler of the Russian Empire, a man who controlled 1/6 of the Earth's land surface, got down on his hands and knees on the carpet. He wound up the little wooden tricycle. He watched as it raced across the floor, climbing over stacks of books that represented enemy bunkers. The Tsar was mesmerized. He laughed like a child. He saw the future of his army in this toy. He immediately ordered Lebedenko to build the real thing. He opened the imperial treasury and gave the engineer 250,000 rubles. In today's money, that is millions of dollars, handed over without a single committee review. Lebedenko took the money and vanished into the forest. He knew he couldn't build this machine in a factory. It was too big to transport. It had to be built right there, on the testing ground. The specifications of the Tsar Tank were staggering. The hull was shaped like a tuning fork. The two massive front wheels were lightweight, using spokes like a bicycle to save weight. But lightweight is relative. They still weighed tons. The rear of the tank was supported by a single smaller wheel, only 5 feet high. This acted as the rudder. Inside the central hull, suspended between the giant wheels, was the crew compartment. It was designed to hold 10 men. They would operate cannons in the top turret to destroy bunkers and machine guns on the belly to sweep the trenches below. But the biggest challenge was power. How do you move 40 tons of steel through the mud? Russian industry didn't have an engine powerful enough, so in a twist of irony, Lebedenko used the enemy's technology. His agents managed to salvage 2 massive Maybach engines from a German Zeppelin airship that had been shot down. These were high-tech, 240-horsepower beasts. So, the Tsar Tank was a Russian design, paid for by the Tsar, but powered by the heart of a German blimp. Construction was a nightmare. The parts had to be dragged through the mud by horses. The winter of 1914 was brutal, but by August of 1915, the monster was finished. The day of the test arrived. It was a gloomy, overcast day. The ground was soft and wet. A group of high-ranking generals and officials arrived from Moscow in their limousines. They stood on a wooden platform, watching the clearing. The pilot, likely Alexander Mikulin, Lebedenko's nephew and chief engineer, climbed the long ladder into the cockpit. He was 40 feet in the air. The mechanics hand-cranked the massive Maybach engines. They roared to life, spitting smoke and oil. The noise was deafening. The vibration shook the leaves off the trees. The signal was given. The pilot engaged the transmission. The chain drives tightened. The giant 9-meter wheels began to turn. At first it was glorious. The Tsar Tank surged forward. It gathered speed. It aimed for a large birch tree in the middle of the clearing. The generals gasped. They expected the tank to stop. Instead, the massive wheel hit the tree and snapped it like a dry twig. The tank rolled over the wreckage without slowing down. It looked unstoppable. For a brief moment, Lebedenko was a genius. But then, the fundamental flaw of the design revealed itself. And it was a flaw that any farmer could have predicted. Physics is unforgiving. Lebedenko had calculated the weight distribution wrong. The front wheels were huge, yes, but the engines were mounted far back, and the rear wheel, that tiny 5-foot wheel, was taking far too much weight. As the tank moved into a patch of soft, marshy ground, the front wheels held up fine, but the rear wheel acted like a knife. It cut through the topsoil and sank. Instantly the tank lost its momentum. The rear of the machine dropped into the mud. The pilot felt the lurch. He pushed the throttles to full power. The 2 Maybach engines screamed. The giant front wheels spun furiously, throwing geysers of mud and water high into the air. They were trying to drag the machine forward. But the rear wheel was effectively an anchor. It was buried up to its axle in thick Russian clay. The tank was stuck. It wasn't defeated by German artillery. It wasn't blown up by a mine. It was defeated by the mud of its own country. For hours, the crew tried to free it. They placed heavy timber planks under the wheels. They tried to winch it out. But 40 tons of dead weight is impossible to move when it is suctioned into a swamp. The generals watched for a while, then checked their watches. They got back in their cars and drove away. They knew what they had seen. It was a failure. The test lasted less than 15 minutes. Lebedenko and his team didn't give up immediately. They guarded the tank. They devised plans to install bigger engines or to replace the rear wheel. But the money had run out. The war situation was getting worse. The Russian army was collapsing. Revolution was in the air. The Tsar had bigger problems than a stuck tricycle in the woods. And so, the Tsar Tank was abandoned. The crew locked the hatches, climbed down the ladder, and walked out of the forest. For the next 7 years, the giant machine sat there. It became a ghostly landmark. Imagine the scene. The seasons changed. Snow fell, covering the giant spokes in white. Spring came and vines started to grow up the rusted legs. Birds built nests inside the cannon barrels. While the tank sat there, the world ended. The Russian Revolution swept the country. The Tsar, who had played with the toy model on his floor, was executed with his family. The empire collapsed, The Soviet Union rose from the ashes. Through it all, the Tsar Tank remained, a silent sentinel in the forest, rusting away. Finally, in 1923, the new Soviet government looked at the records. They saw tons of high-quality steel sitting in the woods. They didn't see a weapon. They saw raw materials. A scrap crew was sent out. They brought cutting torches. It took them days to dismantle it. They cut the giant wheels into sections. They stripped the armor plate. The magnificent Maybach engines were removed. The Netophon was melted down. The metal that was supposed to conquer Berlin was likely turned into tractors, plows, and train tracks for the new communist state. Today, if you go to that forest near Moscow, you won't find the tank. But reports say you can still find the spot. There is a strange, unnatural mound of earth created by the desperate spinning of those giant wheels, and a deep depression where the rear wheel dug its own grave. The Tsar Tank remains a fascinating what-if of history. It represents a time when engineering was driven by wild imagination rather than practical testing. It was the last gasp of the steampunk era, a machine that looked beautiful, terrifying, and majestic, but forgot the simple reality of the ground beneath it. While the ugly, boxy British tanks with their caterpillar tracks went on to change the world, the Tsar Tank died as it lived, a giant stuck in the past. Thanks for watching Iron Legacy. If you enjoyed this story of the Iron Giant that couldn't walk, hit the subscribe button. And let me know in the comments, if they had put tracks on this machine instead of wheels, do you think it would have been the ultimate weapon of World War I? See you in the next one.